So has our faith been another casualty of this pandemic? I'm delighted to say that the Reverend Dr William Philip, Senior Minister of the Tron Church in Glasgow, joins me now. Good evening, Reverend.
Good evening.
First of all, we've seen a gradual lifting of COVID restrictions in recent weeks. How much of a tonic has that been to you, your colleagues and your parishioners?
Well, I think it's certainly been welcomed. We've had a very long 18 months, haven't we, in the churches, just as in everywhere else. People are weary, and I think many people have been feeling for a long time it's way past the time we should be getting back much more towards normal lives. So I think, yes, it's been encouraging, but it's been a long time in coming.
Of course, Reverend, you are an admired local cleric, but you're also a reluctant campaigner, aren't you? And you found yourself part of a coalition of clerics, of people of faith leaders, taking the Scottish Government to court over closing churches during lockdown. That was earlier this year. Why did you take that course of action?
Well, you're right, reluctantly, but we were really forced into it because Scotland became the only part of the United Kingdom where churches and other places of worship, in fact, any public worship, was proscribed. So from Christmas right through till Easter, we were under a ban to gather even 2 or 3 people in public in a park to pray was made illegal. Everywhere else in the United Kingdom, churches, other faiths were able to meet, and we weren't. And we felt there was no real reason for that. We felt it was grossly disproportionate. And arguments fell on deaf ears. We wrote letters, we tried to persuade, but ultimately, as in fact one of the members of the Scottish Parliament wrote to me, saying the only way you'll get anywhere with this is by taking the matter to court. And I'm afraid that's in the end what we had to do.
And it's a cruel irony, isn't it, Reverend, that at a time of economic and health crisis, which the pandemic has presented, that people of faith were not able to seek comfort from, yourself or fellow worshippers, and also the calm, meditative environment of a church. Yes, I mean, I think that has been one of the very great mistakes that governments have made over this last 18 months. I think the very time when you are facing as a nation a great crisis is the very time that the church is needed most of all. That's what's always happened in the past, wartime, in times of great crisis. The governments of the day have recognised that the church has got a very important place in the life of society, a leadership position. It's not the same as the government, but it is alongside the government, and that spiritual leadership in a time of crisis is something that's very, very important. Spiritual leadership, moral leadership. We haven't had that from the government. We can't have that from secular governments. And so, at a time when many people were fearful, people were suffering, people were facing death, that avenue of support, of comfort, and of courage was cut off from them. And I think that's been a very great shame. I think it has been to the detriment of the national response to this pandemic and its aftermath. And so I think it's a very great shame. I think governments have been to blame in that, but I think perhaps churches, church leaders also must bear some of the blame. Perhaps we just accepted far too quickly, too easily, that we were a non-essential service. And I think that betrays a lack of confidence in the church. Nobody would say that the fire brigade's a non-essential service. Nobody would say that hospitals are non-essential services. But if we in the church don't believe that the matters we deal with are even more important than bodily health and life, then who on earth else is going to believe that? And of course, a church, a synagogue, a mosque, this is a place in which people can receive spiritual but also emotional support, meet up with other people, and of course, receive practical help. I mean, a church like yours, the Tron in Glasgow, provides quite practical and in many ways physical help, tangible help. Indeed, we do, as do many other churches, and often it is for some of those who are least able to get help elsewhere. I mean, we have a couple of ministries in particular that would be in that category. One is to those who are struggling with addiction of various kinds, and that is a massive problem in Scotland. We I'm afraid, top the league tables in Europe, if not in the world, for drug deaths, and a report just this past week showed that. And it's worth saying that twice the number of people died in Scotland last year under the age of 65 from drug overdoses as from COVID. But the ability to help those folk has been severely curtailed. Also, we have a big ministry among many asylum seekers. And again, some of these are the most vulnerable people, frightened people, people who have escaped from terribly oppressive regimes. Many of them have found this past 18 months extremely difficult, very frightening. And these are just some, but I mean, so many people. People are human beings. We're not just a collection of cells. We're not just a network of organs. Life is much more than just brain waves and a pulse. People are whole human beings, and protecting people's physical health and well-being involves all of a person, their personality, their needs, their emotions, their griefs, and I'm afraid we've focused far too narrowly on health as just the prevention of one particular viral infection. I think that's been very short-sighted, and I think the sequelae of that are going to be with us for a very, very long time, long after the acute issue of COVID disease is past.
Not wishing to cast judgment on our governments, who clearly have been faced with an unprecedented crisis, and, you know, who would be the First Minister at a time like this, or the Prime Minister, of course. But do you feel that lockdowns are un-Christian?
I agree that governments, I think, have had a very difficult time, of course. I'm glad I'm not the Prime Minister. But I do think that the action of lockdown, in the way that so many countries have pursued it, for whatever reasons, whether it was fear, knee-jerk, copying others, I do think it has resulted in a great deal of dehumanizing. And in that respect, I think, yes, there is an argument to say that it's anti-Christian, because human beings are made in the image of God. We're made as relational beings. We're created for a relationship with God, but also with one another. And isolation and rupturing of these kind of relationships is very damaging to the human person. And just as I was saying, the damage is multifaceted. And I do think that the evidence seems to show that the response to the pandemic and the problems that accrue from that are going to be, perhaps already are, very much greater than the disease itself. And I do think that big mistakes have been made. I think one of the things that I think has troubled me is that no dissent has been tolerated. When governments have to make very difficult decisions, one would hope that they would be taking into account the widest possible range of views and of expertise. And I think what we've seen is, very sadly, some very eminent, capable, experienced people from science, from many disciplines, have been shut out. It's not that they've been disagreed with but they've been demonized. And it's become very difficult to have reasoned and rational and polite discussion about these things, because immediately swear words are thrown at you, like anti-lockdown or COVID denier or anti-vaxxer or things like this. And these kind of things have been thrown at highly eminent people. I mean, people who've won Nobel Prizes, people who, until just a year ago, were held up as paragons of the scientific process. And so I think all of those things are worrying for our society, not just for this particular immediate problem of the pandemic, but for the future. It does seem that we are drifting more and more to a kind of society where only one philosophy, only one view is tolerated. And that goes for a number of things other than just COVID. And that I think must be worrying. And that certainly is anti-Christian. Our society has been built upon Christian foundations. Judeo-Christian morality has underpinned our culture for 2,000 years. And I think we are in great danger if we turn our back on many of the things that have enlightened our lives through that. And that is a concern, I think, to me and to many others at this time.
I'd like to thank your colleagues at the Heart Group, who are an organisation of medics, scientists and other leaders who are concerned about the impact of lockdowns. I know you're a member of and a signatory to Heart. They've got their own website. You're also a signatory, William, to a letter to the government about COVID vaccine passports, and you're very concerned about these. What is the main bone of contention when it comes to COVID vaccine passports?
Yes, that letter to the Prime Minister highlights essentially three things. We think that it is medically illogical and irrelevant, but more than that, we think it's socially immoral. And finally, and most importantly to us as churchmen, we think it's theologically impossible to have vaccine passports. You can probably tell I'm a preacher with those 3 points. But you don't need me to tell you. Plenty of medics and others will tell you that what we know is that vaccines protect the person who takes the vaccine, not others. Showing proof of vaccination does not mean that you are safer to be around than any other healthy asymptomatic person. The original vaccine trials did not show that the vaccine prevents transmission. And we now know from real-world data all the way around the world, from this country, from Israel, from Iceland, from some of the most highly vaccinated countries, that those who are infected after being vaccinated, of which there are many, especially now with the Delta variant, they are just as infectious to other people as those who have been vaccinated. So there's absolutely no logic whatsoever for vaccine passports as being some sort of guarantee of safety. But even if there were some medical benefit, which there clearly is not, even if there were, there are all kinds of dangers here that we have to think about. There's a danger of making our society even more divisive than it has become in recent years. And we really are becoming very divided in all sorts of ways. Brexit and COVID has only accentuated that. But dividing people on this basis of discriminating against them, that is very dangerous to society. In your previous slot, you were talking about this to some degree, and coercing people against their own desire, against their own consciences in some cases, against their own beliefs about vaccination is a very dangerous thing. We can end up creating a medical apartheid. And that smacks of very ugly things. There are fascistic tendencies there. The danger of creating an underclass of people and then blaming that underclass of people for all our problems. There's all the issues of the surveillance of the state creeping more and more and more into people's lives. So there are a host of things which have been recognised by many people to be very problematic for these, even if there was a rationale. But most important for us as churchmen writing the letter is it's just absolutely impossible theologically for the church to close its doors to a sort of untouchable class, to say, no, that there are certain people who cannot hear the life-saving gospel of Jesus Christ because you can't prove to us your health status. Our Lord Jesus went about touching people with leprosy, putting himself right in the midst of the outcasts, those that a polite society saw as a scourge upon them. Our message is for the sick. Jesus said, it's not the healthy who need a physician, it's the sick. I've come to seek and to save the lost. I've come to heal the sick. For churches to shut people out on that basis is quite simply impossible. And I don't believe self-respecting churches would want to do that at all. And I really hope that they will resist it very, very strongly. Indeed, I think we must do. Otherwise, we would be the greatest hypocrites. We could not preach the message of Jesus if that was our activity.
And your remarks will resonate with many people watching, including Bev, who has emailed gbviews@gbnews.uk. As a Christian, says Bev, I feel marginalised. I've been at home for 5 years due to my husband's illness, from which he passed away in 2018. I was just getting over the grief when, wham, I could not go to church as it was shut. Faith is not fear. If our substance is coming from a government who are pushing a climate of fear, then what do you get? I stand for freedom in Jesus Christ and freedom of my fellow man. Meanwhile, Mike has tweeted in, if God is everywhere, Reverend, surely you can worship wherever you are and not need a church.
Well, absolutely. That is certainly true. Worship has nothing to do with buildings, but it is to do with the building, which is the people of God gathering together. And the very word church, ecclesia, means gathering. It means those gathered together. And so it is only as the people of God gather together to worship God corporately that they are, in fact, being the church. So that was really the fundamental issue in our judicial review against the Scottish government. We weren't simply talking about buildings at all. We were talking about corporate gatherings of the church, which have been made illegal even in the open air. So yes, absolutely quite right. It doesn't. Buildings, in many senses, are simply shelters to keep the rain off us, which are particularly necessary in the west of Scotland, let me say. They can be rather beautiful, and it's lovely when they are. But that's all they do. They allow the true church, the people of God, to gather. And unless the people of God are gathering, there is no church. And that's why it's so important.
And Reverend, clock's against us, unfortunately, but let me just put a couple of other points made by our viewers. We heard from Mike there. Jack on Twitter asks, what do you say to people who ask, why didn't God stop the closures or even stop COVID misery and COVID deaths?
Well, the answer to that, I'm afraid, is that God, this world is not as God created it. God created the world for us to live in obedience to Him, under His rule and under His lordship. It was human beings who turned their back on that and said, "No, God, we can have a better stab at running the world ourselves. Thank you very much." And I'm afraid that's the results that we're living with. So the world, as we know it today, is a world where human beings have rejected the leadership, the authority, and the rule of God. That's why the Christian gospel is needed, to bring people back under the rule of God in obedience to Jesus Christ. And that is what Christ came to do, to bring about a recreation of this world. And we long for His coming. And when He comes again, all sin and all death will indeed be expunged forever, and there will be the fullness of life everlasting. That's the Christian message. That's why we need it, and it is in this hope that we are saved.
William, my viewers don't pull their punches. Jennifer on Twitter asks, the Archbishop of Canterbury is more interested in identity politics than genuinely helping people less fortunate. Do you agree? Now, I'm sure you're not going to be overly critical of the Archbishop of Canterbury, but do you think that leadership within religious organisations, including the Church of England, the Church of Scotland, have a case to answer?
Well, as a member of the Christian Church and as a leader in the Christian Church, I bear some of that corporate responsibility, and I think that church leaders have been found wanting. I think they have been, and senior leaders, I'm afraid, have not led. In many ways, they've been hidden. It's been one of the most embarrassing things as a church leader to have writers, columnists asking the question, "Where is Christian leadership at a time of crisis?" And I'm afraid it's difficult to defend. I would have to say the same for all denominations, Church of England, others. The Roman Catholic Church, many Catholics have spoken to me and been very, very upset about the lack of leadership from Catholic bishops and leaders too. So it's a universal failing, I'm afraid. We have to hold up our hands to that. And the answer is for the church to regain its confidence, regain the gospel, and do its true job, not getting involved in trivial matters of politics, but in the great matters of the day and in the great matters of eternity, and speaking the truth in love to those who lead our nations, because they cannot do it without the wisdom of God.